This course approaches Wittgenstein with a bold hypothesis that his three central pillars, the private language argument, the rule-following paradox, and the thesis that the limits of my language mean the limits of my world, are not scattered remarks, but a single axis. The private language argument shows us why meaning cannot live in a hidden interior. A language that belonged to one isolated mind would dissolve on contact with itself. The rule-following paradox drives the point further. No secret chain of finite instructions could ever secure the leap into meaning. Every attempt to ground rules in hidden formulae collapses back into circularity until we strike the only rock Wittgenstein allows, our practices, where we are trained to see patterns and repeat them. And from here, the axis comes full circle. The limits of language thesis reveals that what philosophy calls depth is nothing mystical. It is nothing more and nothing less than the grammar of our practices, turned into the mechanics of possible inferences. We mistake this machine of grammar for a hidden metaphysics, but Wittgenstein teaches us to see it for what it is, the surface where meaning lives. Taken together, these are not three problems, but a unified path. A refusal of private depths and a redirection toward the ordinary, where rules, grammar, and human practices converge to form the true space of meaning. This reading of Wittgenstein is not abstract theory. It comes from the work of Lucas Vollet, with a PhD from the Federal University of Santa Catarina, visiting researcher under Paul Guyer at Brown University, and author of studies on Kant published internationally, as well as recent essays on Quine and Wittgenstein. The course itself is built on two pillars. First, the author's commentaries on camera after each video essay, clarifying and expanding the arguments. And second, the video essays themselves, crafted in a documentary style with voiceovers polished for understanding, and an interplay of images and music designed to layer perspectives, helping the student re-signify the content through a multi-dimensional experience.
What you are seeing is paragraph 28 of Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigations. Yes, here it is, a paragraph that pretends to hand us the prototype of meaning, the shortcut, the finger-pointing, the word spoken. The fastest route, the neatest bridge, the illusion of clarity. But then, complication, of course, because even the extensive definition, the so-called pure beginning, turns out to be nothing of the sort. It is not the origin, it is not the foundation, it is simply another path in the labyrinth. In the labyrinth, endless, no single entry, no final exit, just corridors upon corridors, all of them equal in weight, all of them bound by a grammar you never chose but must inhabit. One can be trained this way or that way, or in a dozen different ways, and arrive apparently at the same outcome. But don't be fooled, each of these outcomes is already a mediation, already the echo of rules you never authored. So let us be clear, there will be no perfect equivalence, no immaculate path, no ultimate definition. And yet, that is precisely where Wittgenstein leaves us, in a world where grammatical normativity does not appear as grammar at all, but as myth, as metaphysics, as religion. And if you want to see how far this illusion stretches, into our consciousness, our culture, our modernity, well, that's what my course is for. Hi and welcome. In this video, I want to show that Wittgenstein's remarks are not just dismissals of philosophy, but a call for pluralism in how meaning is worked out. By putting three famous paragraphs from the philosophical investigations together, we see that Wittgenstein resists the idea that philosophy can discover meaning itself in some higher domain. The danger is not just metaphysics, but any conceptual practice that claims to stand above ordinary use. Yet, the third passage opens a space. Philosophy is not abolished, but multiplied into diverse therapies. Each therapy is not a quick fix, but a way of staging philosophy's capacity to revisit, reframe, and recalibrate the grammar of her concepts. So that's a setup. From here, most of the essay will come to you in voiceover, which is a bit of a trade. You will hear more ideas, but see a little less of me.
This video will play along with the game of quick content, but it will also challenge the easy thesis that nothing of substance can be learned from such a method. I begin with three passages from Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigations, brief, almost casual remarks, followed by my own commentary. If they seem fragmentary, that is the point. Wittgenstein preferred sparks to sermons. What matters is not that they settle questions, but that they point, like signposts, toward the kind of work philosophy can really do. Then I will explain how I interpret them as Wittgenstein's contribution to the questions, what is meaning? Or what are the routes by which meaning is formed, curated, self-evaluated, criticized, treated? Our answer is that Wittgenstein arbitrates for a pluralism that is not anti-philosophical, but opposed to any form of philosophy that does not admit plurality. In this case, I'll need you to follow me to see the direction in which they point, according to my perspective, of course, which you will have every chance to disagree with, provided you grant me the favor of watching it all the way through. First passage. PI 109. Philosophy is a battle against the bewitchment of our intelligence by means of language. Second passage. PI 124. Philosophy may in no way interfere with the actual use of language. It can, in the end, only describe it, for it cannot give it any foundation either. It leaves everything as it is. Third passage. PI 133. There is not a philosophical method, though there are indeed methods, like different therapies.
At first sight, taken together, these three passages make Wittgenstein seem to be picking a fight with a rare and exotic enemy, the metaphysician with his looseness and caprices. It is easy to imagine the theoretical physicist shrugging, "This does not concern me. Let the theologians and ideologues be worried." My reading frustrates that relief. What Wittgenstein is doing here, I think, is arbitrating against any passage from the domain where meaning is nothing more than the simplest alignment of elements in the mechanics of communication. Language in use, outcomes distributed, to a higher order domain, where the philosopher claims to have discovered meaning itself. It is this move that produces the effect of enchantment. The gray zone becomes clearer here. It is not only the obvious types of metaphysics that fall under Wittgenstein's knife, it is conceptual activity as such, whenever it grows richer and pretends to speak about itself. The bewitchment is precisely the illusion that the machinery generating conceptual outcomes can be recast as a metascience. A second-order account of human meaning, authorship, or some private depth.
But in the last of the quotations, he leaves something open. The plurality of the modes in which this process of grammatical self-assessment occurs, which, we argue, cancels the enchantment. The reading of this last remark redeems the idea that Wittgenstein condemns every kind of richer, more superstructured conceptual construction. He condemns only those that cause bewitchment. When he speaks of therapy, then, Wittgenstein does not believe, in our opinion, that there exists a universal and magical form of cure, not a definitive clarification, not a final synopsis, not a single conclusive interpretation of a problem, like a mathematical solution, a decisive legal maneuver, or an unstoppable diplomatic move. Instead, he trusts in the existence of diverse therapies, and we, as humanity, engaged in the mediation and resignification of our practices through diverse technologies and mediations, come to know ourselves in this plurality. This is our reading.
Wittgenstein saw it first. Kripke sharpened it. The Kripkenstein paradox. What follows is my own variation. Someone teaches Dr. Harper that 7 plus 5 equals 12 and hands him an abacus to make sure that if he gets it right, the very mechanics of the result are fixed, finite, tangible. From the outside, we watch. Beads slide, chalk squeaks, and every time we ask, 7 plus 5 equals, he writes 12. A colleague nods. Perfect, you're following the rule. But here's the trouble. What guarantees that Harper's 12 means what we mean by 12? Perhaps in his code, 12 names what we call 13, and everything else in his arithmetic has shifted to match. Objection, says the colleague. If his answers always match ours, why not say he's following the rule? If any internally consistent code can be made to fit the evidence, then the fit itself is never the anchor. The anchor is us, the shared practice that tells us which meaning to see. Without that shared ground, even a perfectly aligned abacus is just a silent machine, clicking out symbols whose sense might be anyone's guess. From an external perspective, we observe the sliding of beads, the inscription of the figures 1 and 2, and the consistent production of 12 in response to the query 7 plus 5 equals what? The natural temptation, voiced here by the imagined colleague, is to treat this observable regularity as conclusive evidence that Harper means by 12 exactly what we do. Yet this is precisely where the skeptical thrust of Section 201 of Wittgenstein's philosophical investigation bites. For the possibility cannot be excluded that Harper's internal calculus is systematically deviant, that in his idiolect 12 names what we would call 13, and that his rules of addition and subsequent computations have been adjusted so that this divergence never surfaces in his overt performances. In such a case, agreement in all finite applications would be compatible with a radical divergence in meaning. Wittgenstein's point is that the fit between rule and response is not an intrinsic property of the symbols or the procedure, not even when realized in a concrete mechanical device like the abacus, but is fixed by our practices of teaching, checking, and sanctioning. Some philosophers, orphans of logicism, and of the dream that arithmetic could be reduced to pure logic, as one might call them, protest that such a numerical coincidence between right and wrong results is absurd, that mathematics cannot be so radically open to interpretation. Yet the force of the example does not depend on its likelihood. It lies in the fact that nothing in the formal procedure itself rules out the deviant interpretation. The abacus, the neat inscription of 12, even an infinite list of outputs that appear correct, none of these secure a single, privileged mapping between sign and meaning. That stability comes only from the tacit agreements of a shared practice. And if those agreements were to dissolve, the beads would still slide, the numerals would still appear, but the rule they obey could be anything at all.
If you made it this far, I think it's worth saying that most of you have probably thought of one objection, and it's a natural one, at least for most people. The idea is that for Mr. Harper to keep producing a consistent result using deviant methods, he would need to make adjustments that, in the long run, would probably be unsustainable. For someone who sees mathematics as a field of structural possibilities a priori, building structures like this, or superstructures like this, is possible, but it would not stay stable over time. But that's a discussion for another place. At least think about this for now. In the real world, adjustments like this are made all the time to create coincidences between things that do not really match in the base structure. And this creates many forms of misunderstanding. Although that's not a problem for mathematicians, but for sociologists and others who have to deal with rule conflicts in far more dramatic situations.
Welcome to 7 Minutes of Philosophy of Mind, the only podcast where we promise philosophical enlightenment in less time than it takes to brew a decent cup of coffee. Today's episode, Wittgenstein, and the curious misfortune of seeking meaning in rules. Now, if you know anything about Wittgenstein, you'll know he had a peculiar talent for turning clarity into confusion and then insisting that the confusion was, in fact, the real clarity. But then again, this was a man who once left philosophy to teach elementary school, only to resign in frustration because his students couldn't grasp logic as well as he thought they should. That, my friends, is the kind of optimism only a philosopher could have. But more importantly, Wittgenstein spent his life agonizing over whether rules can truly determine their own application. Spoiler alert, he decided they can't, and the rest of us have been trying to pretend we didn't hear him ever since. So today we ask, can rules really tell us what to do, or do they just sit there, smugly waiting for us to interpret them? And if meaning doesn't come from the rules themselves, where does it come from? A secret metaphysical vault? Some kind of linguistic magic trick? Or more likely, from the messy, practical, and entirely unphilosophical way humans actually live? Let's find out. Imagine this. You're in a classroom, pencil in hand, diligently solving a math problem. The teacher walks by, glances at your work, and nods approvingly. You followed the rule. Or did you? Ludwig Wittgenstein, one of the great philosophical troublemakers of the 20th century, poses a deceptively simple question. But how can a rule show me what to do at this point? From Philosophical Investigations, section 198. This isn't just an ivory tower puzzle. Every time you use a word, every time you obey or disobey a rule, you're stepping into a centuries-old battleground over meaning. Do words mean things because we intend them to? If following a rule were just a matter of repeating past behavior, then any new instance could fit an infinite number of patterns. But if it's not about strict repetition, then what exactly is it? Perhaps the problem isn't with the rule, but with our expectation that meaning is something fixed and determinate. Maybe meaning, like language itself, is just a network of dispositions, our responses shaped by social conditioning and pragmatic success. In today's episode, we'll examine the skeptical challenge of rule following through a naturalized lens. Can meaning be anchored in behavior alone? Or do we need something more? Is meaning just a ghost in the machine? Or is there something deeper, something woven into our daily practices and social lives? You punch 2 + 2 into a calculator and out pops 4. A small triumph for arithmetic, a moment of trust in the cold precision of machinery. But hold on, why are we so sure this little box of circuits and silicon is really doing addition? Maybe it's just mechanically responding to inputs, like a player piano mindlessly following a script. Wittgenstein, with his usual taste for deflation, warns us. Any interpretation still hangs in the air along with what it interprets and cannot give it any support. That's from Philosophical Investigations, section 198. The calculator doesn't mean addition in our sense, it simply outputs results based on an algorithm, and who's to say we're any different? Now, imagine our trusty calculator suddenly starts producing strange results for numbers larger than 1,000. Turns out it wasn't following addition after all. It was following some bizarre rule we'll call QUS, which mimics addition for small numbers, but deviates beyond a certain point. Were we really adding all along or just fooling ourselves? This is the skeptical nightmare of meaning. No finite number of past cases can guarantee what a rule requires in the future. Maybe meaning is just a vague habit, a pragmatic convention that works well enough until it doesn't. But if that's true, then what stops all of language from slipping out from under us? Case 2. Consider words such as money, justice, and friendship. These are not fixed designators of static properties, but shifting nodes within a web of interdependent beliefs and practices. Their significance is not grounded in isolated definitions, but in their role within evolving patterns of human interaction. Money is not simply a medium of exchange. Its meaning is embedded in a network of expectations, trust, and institutional arrangements that evolve under historical and economic pressures. We understand what money is by grasping how it functions within practices of trade, inflation, and shifting norms of value. Justice does not derive its meaning from a set of necessary and sufficient conditions. Rather, it reflects historically contingent structures of legal, moral, and political coordination. Its role is not static, but continually shaped by changing conditions of human life. Even a term as familiar as friend is no exception. The role of friendship in a hunter-gatherer society is not the same as in an era dominated by digital mediation. The concept shifts as social structures and technological conditions transform the expectations and commitments embedded in the term. But if meaning depends on historical and social entanglements, consider a radical case: the swamp man. Suppose lightning strikes a swamp, spontaneously creating an exact duplicate of me, molecule for molecule. The swampman looks like me, sounds like me, and from an internal perspective appears to think as I do. Yet it has no history of interactions, no web of prior interpretations, no participation in the social practices that give words their significance. Could it mean anything by its words? Could it really be referring to money, justice, or friendship in the same way I do? This illustrates that meaning is not simply a matter of internal representations or computational structures. A purely syntactic system, no matter how complex, cannot capture these historical shifts unless it is embedded within an evolutionary framework, one that tracks the function of concepts through use, interpretation, and social coordination over time. To mean anything at all is to be situated within a world of interdependent speakers, histories, and evolving communicative practices. The Wittgensteinian take. From a Wittgensteinian perspective, the so-called failure of AI to understand meaning is not merely a technical limitation, but a misunderstanding of what meaning consists in. Understanding is not just a matter of correctly manipulating symbols according to formal rules. It is a practical social activity, a matter of taking part in a game of giving and asking for reasons. Meaning is not something statically encoded in symbols, but something that emerges dynamically through inferential articulation and communal practice. AI, then, does not fail to mean in the way a human might misunderstand. It simply does not occupy the normative space of reasons at all. It operates in a different kind of system, one that lacks the social and historical entanglements that make genuine understanding possible. Last reflection. A final attempt at clarity, or at least a witty approximation of it. It is, of course, the peculiar habit of philosophers to assume that words, once written down, contain within them the power to resolve the very confusions they have created. One might even suspect that the entire profession thrives on a certain kind of industrious futility, constructing conceptual labyrinths only to feign surprise when no obvious exit presents itself. And so, as we reach this so-called last reflection, we might pause to ask, what precisely have we been reflecting upon? The nature of meaning? The mechanics of rule following? Or merely the human tendency to demand certainty from an existence that, in its more candid moments, seems rather indifferent to such demands? So here we are, standing at the edge of yet another philosophical quagmire. On one side, the reductionist clings to his rule following, certain that meaning can be captured in finite steps. On the other, the skeptic scoffs, insisting that meaning is a delicate artifact of history, culture, and use, far too grand to be pinned down by mere syntax. And somewhere in between, the rest of us get on with life, speaking, thinking, understanding, without worrying too much about whether our words have foundations or not. But before we go, let's leave the last word, almost, to Wittgenstein. If following a rule isn't just a matter of repeating past cases, then what is it? If meaning is always hanging in the air, dependent on interpretation, then how do we ever know what we mean? Do we simply play the game and hope for the best? And what about this very conversation? You've been listening to a machine-generated script, structured according to linguistic rules but lacking, one hopes, an ineffable grasp of meaning. Yet here we are, understanding one another, or at least pretending to. So, let me ask you, have you ever had one of my responses, artificial or not, sound just natural enough to make you wonder? What if I were a swampman, conjured from pure chance but still producing words that seem meaningful? And if that's the case, how do we know, with certainty, that meaning ever required an original thinker at all? See you next time.
In this video essay, I return to philosophical investigations, not merely as a source of conceptual puzzles, but as a philosophical scalpel used to slice through the ideological crust of 20th century thought. The central passage, section 201, so often reduced to a paradox about rule following, is reframed here as a moment of epistemological rupture. For those of you finding this channel for the first time, the style of argument here draws from academic philosophy, but it also allows itself to remain porous, responsive to the peculiar demands of the tool that mediates the content. This content is not neutral. It teaches us what kinds of reactions a certain style provokes, what kind of person is drawn to this material, who recoils, who returns. These patterns are not just data. They shape what I call a philosophical ecosystem, one that's not pre-programmed, but gradually constructed through the reciprocal encounter between thought, form, and audience. If you've landed here, you're already participating in that process. Back to the thread. I argue that Wittgenstein was not offering a neat paradox, nor was he surrendering to a scholastic kind of skepticism, the kind that thrives on needless puzzles about whether one can model reference without the sky collapsing. Instead, he was staging something far more radical. He was showing that the certainty we associate with rules, with meanings, and even with inner mental states is not self-evident. It's sedimented. It rests on inherited patterns of behavior, on forms of life that have been mistakenly projected as neutral, timeless, or foundational. What we treat as epistemic clarity may, under scrutiny, reveal itself as historical artifact, a coded grammar of thought that only feels natural because it is hardened into invisibility. This brings us back to Wittgenstein's section 201, arguably the most cited and most foundational passage in what we now call the rule-following problem. He writes, "This was our paradox. No course of action could be determined by a rule, because every course of action can be made out to accord with the rule." What is he doing here? One of two things, or perhaps both. First, he's showing that we are trained to follow a rule in one particular way rather than another. Yet the very code we use to describe that behavior can be rewritten, and rewritten again. Second, he's showing that the sense of what ought to follow, the entire normative dimension, must come from somewhere else entirely. This idea that no formal rule carries within itself the guarantee of its own correct application is not, for Wittgenstein, a self-contained puzzle. It's the foundation stone for a philosophical diagnosis. To see why, we have to step back into his world, an intellectual climate of supercomputational optimism, a time when logical positivism promised to draw a sharp line between the meaningful and the meaningless, the scientific and the pseudo-scientific. armed only with formal criteria to secure conceptual legitimacy. But Wittgenstein disrupted that mission of purification. Instead of embracing the myth of scientific neutrality or the dream of absolute clarity, he asked, how are these very levels, these claims to reason, consensus, objectivity, themselves distinguished from myths? The myth of private language, the myth of intersubjective consensus, the myth of essential mental features, the myth of the transparency of meaning. Under Wittgenstein's lens, these once deep metaphysical commitments are not simply refuted, they are deactivated, revealed as forms of life, solidified into grammatical certainties, then reified into ideological structures. So first, yes, rule following is Wittgenstein's version of a skeptical challenge as intense as Hume's. Kripke made that point in Wittgenstein on Rules and Private Language back in 1982. But it is not only that. It is not designed to trap us in a dead end. It is not about being stuck between I follow the rule and I know what I am doing, in the sense of dissecting my own rule following like a specimen in a lab. For Wittgenstein, we don't need to cross that bridge. Or, if we do, we enter a different kind of commitment, a grammatical one. And that bridge leads somewhere strange. It leads into a mythology, an illusory terrain where our imagination lives. So I end with this suggestion. Wittgenstein's engagement with skepticism was never about pushing meaning into arbitrariness. It was about revealing what lies beneath our ontological identification frameworks, those intricate superstructures we build to map reality. He knew they were artifices, and he saw how easily they could harden into myths. The myth that consensus is natural, the myth that the frontiers of meaning are eternal, the myth that self-consciousness is simply the sequel to common sense and paradigmatic order. If you want to explore this in more depth and see how it connects to Hume's skeptical challenge, Kripke's reading of the private language argument, and the pragmatic turn in Wittgenstein's later thought, I have an academic article dedicated to precisely this terrain. It's titled, The Modern Skeptical Challenge Reflected in the Private Language Argument, a retelling of Saul Kripke's reading of Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations. It was published in Voluntas Revista Internacional de Filosofia, Volume 12, Number 2, in 2021. You can read it open access. There I develop this same argument, that Wittgenstein doesn't simply stop at the paradox, but repositions it as a way of exposing the lived metaphysics embedded in our forms of life. Because in the end, these are not just theoretical structures, they are the metaphysics we inhabit.
This essay begins from a simple claim. The moments when grammar is at stake, when our shared forms of meaning begin to slip, are not rare anomalies, but central features of modern life. Far from being confined to academic puzzles, such disruptions appear everywhere. In translation, in scientific shifts, in political recognition. Now, to defend this claim, we shall enlist, who else? Wittgenstein. But not as a loyal foot soldier, marching under the banner of therapeutic quietism. No, this will be philosophical judo, using Wittgenstein against himself. A maneuver which, I admit, some may find a bit too clever for my own good. And maybe they're right. After all, I'm presenting this on a personal platform, one that dares to mediate the unmediated, to speak without consensus, without peer review, without the comforting glow of institutional lighting. But since I can't afford a better mediation, I'll at least proceed with maximum awareness of my own epistemic insolvency. In the end, you're entirely free to close this tab and return to more properly sanctioned content. But for those who stay, welcome. To begin unfolding this thesis, we draw on a strand of scholarship that sees continuity, not rupture, between early and late Wittgenstein. This view resists the common trope that casts philosophical investigations as a rejection of the Tractatus, suggesting instead that both works share a deeper metaphilosophical concern with the limits of representation and the conditions under which meaning becomes livable. Authors like James Klage, Wittgenstein in Exile, 2011, and David Stern, Wittgenstein on Mind and Language, 1995, argue that the shift lies not in substance, but in tone, method, emphasis. Both phases remain committed to the same core tension, that language is never just a tool. It's embedded in our forms of life. It speaks us, even as we try to speak through it. My own thesis is that this continuity plays out in two philosophical gestures. In the Tractatus, meaning is confined to what can be shown, not said, because anything propositional must be modeled in a way that excludes any superpropositional domain. Philosophy, in that world, cannot intervene from above. It can only point. Later, in the Philosophical Investigations, Wittgenstein abandons the model theoretic approach. He rejects the old referential schemes, like the clunky Augustinian image of naming, and shifts to a view where meaning is negotiated through practice, through life. Yet even here, he draws a hard line. We remain ontologically blind to anything beyond the grammar of our behaviors, those trained, domesticated, sedimented acts that make up what we call the ordinary. This gives rise to what I call a quietist economy of ontology. We are allowed to speak, but only insofar as our speech fits the grammar. If metaphysics is ever allowed back in the room, it's only when grammar itself begins to crack. And the phrase from Wittgenstein that sums this up? In philosophy, we do not advance explanations. We bring words back from their metaphysical to their everyday use. But in this video, we propose a comeback, a philosophical re-entry into those places where the so-called neutrality of life conceals its deepest ontological fault lines, places where grammar fails. Two domains are chosen with care, each reinforcing the claim that the ordinary is anything but simple. 1. Translation. If you believe that translation is just another empirical domain, a matter of vocabulary lists, grammatical rules, and observed behavior, think again. Translation, in its serious form, forces a confrontation with meaning itself. It demands more than factual accuracy. It requires criteria of equivalence that go far beyond mere extensional match. To translate well is not simply to correlate words. It is to decide what counts as the same across inferential, cultural, and even ontological divides. That means the translator, whether they admit it or not, is operating in a space that is intentional, modal, and in many ways, metaphysical. Two, pre- and post-paradigmatic science. Moments of radical scientific transition, when methods no longer yield consensus and foundational terms become unstable, are not simply gaps to be filled with more data or pauses before the next breakthrough. What remains is a domain of questions that exceed the current conceptual scaffolding, questions that do not arise from the comforting rhythm of empirical revision or automatic confirmation. And once again we ask, is there a choice, a real one, to not go philosophical here? Perhaps only in the thinnest sense. One may choose to approach these ruptures reflectively or unreflectively, consciously or by sheer inertia, but there is no neutral posture available, no purely observational stance. And still, the world keeps demanding answers, not just new data, but new ways of framing what counts as data, what counts as evidence, as causality, as coherence. Because when the conceptual scaffolding breaks, we don't just lose our tools, we lose our sense of what it means to even be oriented. And in that moment, something ancient returns. Not myth, not mysticism, but the raw pressure to mean something in a space where the coordinates have shifted and even the axioms feel like strangers. This is the real weight of philosophical rupture.
Hi everyone, and welcome to my newest essay. So, what I tried to do here was to state Wittgenstein's famous thesis that the meaning of a word is its use. And I tried to do that not really as a clean break from the Tractatus, but I think more as a kind of downplaying of its earlier logical machinery. So instead of treating propositions as formal entities, he shifts attention to words as they are actually used in practice. But of course, there is a cost. Meaning risks collapsing into nothing more than statistical regularity. And that, I think, leaves something crucial out. The deeper, more theoretical, more projected dimension of language. The very thing Carnap and others tried to capture with intentional theories. So, I did not resolve this tension. That wasn't the goal. The goal was to leave it hanging there as a provocation and maybe as a reason to keep thinking. If you stick around for the essay, I think the real high point is still coming. I used the example of two linguists debating what meaning really is in a particular case, when equivalence both supervenes on the speaker's behavior and at the same time somehow exceeds it. That to me is where the problem gets sharper and also most interesting. The thesis Wittgenstein puts forward here is among his most famous, and it has become almost a commonplace to say that it marks a shift in his theory of meaning away from the Tractatus. And here we should pause, because I think this shift is often overstated. From my perspective, as I have noticed somewhere, I don't really exaggerate the degree of rupture between Wittgenstein's early and later positions. But in this case, what deserves attention is what lies behind the very idea of use as a criterion of meaning. So to begin with, use functions as a kind of decisive move. Wittgenstein writes, and notice, the tone here, it's not merely descriptive, it's, I think, a little dismissive, as though for the most part there is nothing more to say, almost as if he's cutting short a debate before it even begins. He seems to play this card almost cynically, as if the ceiling of any debate over what meaning is could be reduced to the statistical aggregate of how a term is regularly employed. In other words, the suggestion is that regularity of usage itself could serve as the upper limit of philosophical explanation. So, from this point of view, the fact that such regularities might later be captured in a syntactic mechanism, a system of rules or equations, where a term plays a stable role, this is secondary, is derivative, not fundamental. What Wittgenstein is really doing here, I think, is not so much refuting the Tractatus as quietly lowering its status. He treats its logical machinery as secondary, perhaps even slightly disparaging it. And this is worth underlining. He isn't exactly contradicting himself, he's changing the priority of things. This means that when we talk about propositions in the Tractatus, that entity supposed to be abstracted mathematically and expressed as a precise logical mechanism, now this is treated as derivative. What comes first is use. This means that a word or sentence acquires its logical role only through use, and it's precisely that repetition of that use, with a certain degree of consistency of course, that makes the role almost statistically verifiable. But this doesn't mark so much a rupture with the Tractatus itself. I think it's more with the broader program advanced by the Vienna Circle. The attempt to emphasize the machine or the syntactic mechanics built upon usage rather than usage itself. Take Carnap, for example. In his essay, Meaning and Synonymy in Natural Languages, he argues something like this. The strategies a linguist uses to capture the irregularities of use from a native speaker, by asking questions, even about hypothetical utterances, can eventually evolve into the construction of a kind of machine. A machine that makes visible the structural relations of equivalence in that language. And this, in turn, is what allows the linguist to arrive at a theory of intention. Intention with an S. So everything suggests that for Carnap and many of his followers, the linguist's work isn't complete until that theory is in place, the theory of intention. Otherwise, one is left with what I would call a coincidental or even occasionalist view of meaning. Now, this thesis, we don't need to call it Carnap's, since he was too busy debating with Quine to aim much energy at Wittgenstein. This thesis could nevertheless be raised against him. It would sound something like this. If use is the ceiling where every debate about meaning ends, then when two translators disagree about divergences in the behavior of speakers, they would have no principled way of resolving it. Take a simple example. One translator insists that the word gla applies only to birds actually in flight. Another insists that informants also use gla for grounded birds preparing to take off. Both can cite regularities in use, but without a higher order account, something like Carnap's intentional machinery, there is no neutral way to settle which captures the real meaning. So I want to leave you with this. Wittgenstein deliberately downplayed the syntactic machinery that codifies meaning. But the price he paid was high, because meaning then risks collapsing into nothing more than a statistical agreement. And what gets lost in that flattening is precisely the deeper, more theoretical, more projective dimension of language. What philosophers call the theory of intention, which remains, in his account, strikingly indeterminate. Our goal today wasn't to solve this problem, but to polemicize it, to highlight this moment of Wittgenstein's investigations. And I also want to leave you with a hint of what comes next. Wittgenstein flattens meaning into agreement in use, not because he denies the deeper dimension, but because, and here is the striking part, he realized something else. Wittgenstein realized that these deeper debates belong to what he calls the grammatical level, and grammar here is not neutral. It is embedded in social normative decisions about what we accept, what we reject, and how we legislate the very boundaries of sense. And yes, this is precisely the point where things become really interesting, which is of course why I am going to stop. Consider this my polite act of academic mischief. So let's stop here. Continue with me, and if this video has enough resonance, I will pick up exactly from this point in the next one. Hi everyone, I'm Lucas. Today I want to look at Wittgenstein's private language argument, a short passage that sounds simple but shakes the foundations of what it means to have a language at all. Take two propositions. One I learn instantly by someone pointing and saying that. Another takes me years of training to master. Their acquisition is worlds apart. Yet, inside the mechanics of a language, its bare syntax, that difference leaves no trace. To me, it's enormous, but to the language, it's invisible. You could say it's like pressing two different keys on a piano. One might take a child seconds to find, another might take a pianist years of training to perform in contest. But the instrument itself registers both with the same mechanical touch. And what does this have to do with a private language? Well, it shows that no code is essentially more secret, more hermetic, or more difficult than another. Our histories and our struggles may attach deeper meaning to certain propositions, but from the perspective of syntax alone, they don't differ. In the video up next, I use this variation to walk through Wittgenstein's private language argument, opening new angles, and along the way I bring in Fodor, Descartes and Wittgenstein together, testing how far each can go in explaining what private really means. If this sparks your interest, stay with it, and you can also find a full course on Udemy, Wittgenstein and the Limits of Meaning, where we push these questions even further.
This essay, or lecture script, proposes an elegant and historically grounded contrast between two of the most influential figures of 20th century analytic philosophy, Ludwig Wittgenstein and Rudolf Carnap. As I develop this comparison, I intend to make the most of this conceptual exchange as a site of learning, not just for my audience, but for myself. I am convinced that this path offers the most promising trajectory for my course materials. It is what will give them a distinctive tone in a sea of generic content. And so I will conclude by offering my own position, not as a final word, but as a gesture toward the root of my intellectual framework. Through these reflections, we continue to cultivate an ecosystem of ideas that dare to be original. Not because they claim novelty in content, but because they demand a clearer signature and a more progressively self-aware mediator. Before we even begin, let me enumerate the positions, just to make sure we're not debating shadows, but actual commitments, even if they slip. In summary, here's where I stand, and how I see Carnap and Wittgenstein. For Carnap, each of us carries two machines, one to track numerical identities, the basic matching of terms, objects, extensions, and another, more subtle machine, to track richer identities, the equivalences between possibilities, between conceptual structures that differ on the surface, but converge in deeper semantic alignment. For him, stable communication may only arise when our second-level machines converge, when our intentional frameworks line up closely enough to sustain mutual understanding. Wittgenstein, by contrast, doesn't believe in second-level machines. For him, all communication is surface communication. Meaning is use. And where there is misunderstanding, no deeper system can intervene. There is no semantic rescue. No metaphysical device waiting beneath the grammar to translate us back into agreement. As for me, I don't think these second-level machines are illusions, but I don't think they are mechanical either. What we call intentional alignment is often a metaphysics reified, a structure of norms, of expectations, of world positions made invisible by their familiarity. These are not neutral engines of translation. They are forms of imposed uniformity, absorbed so deeply that we live them as if they were the very limits of possibility itself. Not logic, but ideology in its quietest form. Now, after hearing all that, you might not even feel like watching the rest of the video. But stay with me. Sometimes, repeating what you already know is also a way of mediating it, a way of layering new tensions, new textures, into what once felt settled. That too is knowledge. Sources referenced: Rudolf Carnap's article, Meaning and Synonymy in Natural Languages; Ludwig Wittgenstein's Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus; and Philosophical Investigations. The central thesis is not merely that Wittgenstein and Carnap disagree, but that they diverge at the level of what meaning ultimately resists, and more importantly, how they conceive of the role and possibility of semantic theory itself. For Carnap, the theoretical dimension of meaning could ultimately be stabilized, not merely through ostensive definitions or surface-level extensions, but via deeper systems of formal alignment and behavioral pattern recognition. His goal was not only to chart the extensional content of language, identifying which objects satisfy a given predicate, but to articulate its intentional core, that is, the richer internal structure that becomes visible when we are forced to theorize what a sentence means beyond mere substitution. We might call this the pursuit of a stronger equivalence, not just the numerical identity between, say, horses and horses, but the systematic equivalence between all possible horses, or between differently structured sentences that refer to the same class of entities under varied conceptual constraints. But why does this matter to a linguist or a semanticist? After all, aren't these just metaphysical echoes, speculative overlays on an otherwise empirical field? The answer is translation. When we try to translate a sentence from one language to another and must hypothesize about what remains stable through the shift in grammar, culture, and conceptual framing, we are engaging with what Carnap would see as intentional semantics. Let's take a concrete example. Suppose we're translating the sentence, "It is raining," into a language with no direct meteorological subject. A model theoretic approach may attempt to preserve its truth conditions, say by mapping rainfall to some observable atmospheric state. But the meaning, in a deeper sense, requires us to ask, when do speakers in that language choose to make weather statements at all? What counts as rain? Is it a lived phenomenon, a seasonal marker, a cosmological sign? For Carnap, such questions could ultimately be resolved by extending the model, refining the mappings, tuning the variables, incorporating cultural behavior. He sees such theorization as already semantic work, guided by increasingly complex formal criteria. Wittgenstein, by contrast, sees this moment, the moment of theoretical supplementation, not as the refinement of semantics, but as the exposure of its limits. It is precisely where the system must be interpreted that meaning becomes unstable. The rules are no longer simply applied, they are invoked, negotiated, stretched, and in this stretching, meaning slides. What makes this framing powerful is that it traverses both major phases of Wittgenstein's work, not as a rupture, but as a continuity of epistemological restraint. In the Tractatus, the famous proposition, "Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent," is not a withdrawal from meaning, but a recognition of what we might call the subsemantic, the zone where our attempts at representation encounter the limit of conceptual clarity, where theory and life touch inarticulable ways. In the philosophical investigations, this insight returns in an entirely new register, not through mysticism, but through grammatical indeterminacy. Wittgenstein no longer speaks of the sayable and the unsayable, but of how every rule is open to interpretation, and no use guarantees a fixed mapping. The instability is no longer ontological, it's practical, linguistic, communal. This reading leads not to skepticism about theory, but to a radical reorientation of what theory is. We do not abandon the theoretical dimension, but we cease to believe that it can be positive in the Carnapian sense. That is, it cannot be fully codified, instantiated, reduced to syntactic rules, neural nets, or behavioral regularities. The theoretical dimension exists, yes, but it remains a negative space, one that reveals the fragility of alignments rather than securing them. It is a zone of tensions, not a reservoir of axioms, a residue, not a foundation, a rift, not a map.
If you have made it this far, you are either truly interested in semantics, or you have confused this with a cooking video, and you are still waiting for me to explain what is in the sauce. Spoiler, the sauce is ideology. Now, here's my position. Semantics is not a mystery. It is not something magical or beyond the reach of thinking. But it is also not something we can reduce to pattern recognition, to inferential routines, or to syntactic behavior. Think about the difference between English and Chinese. Yes, it is complex, But we will not solve that complexity by improving our mappings or by training better models or by creating more computational rules. Because what we face here is not just a technical problem, it is a deep divergence between two road positions. Still, this does not make the problem unspeakable. It is not mystical. It can be understood, it can be studied. But we must move to another domain, the domain of ideology, a place where metaphysics becomes experience, where language does not only follow grammar, but carries a whole life road. So at this level, the divergences between languages are not just mistakes in alignment. They are echoes of how people live, how they make meaning, how they feel what is real. Semantics lives in this space, not in silence, not in behavior, not in machines, but where metaphysics becomes grammar, and grammar becomes a politics of sense.
Now, did Russell get the last word? We are about to see that he didn't. Because the theory Frege died trying to protect comes back, not as a ghost, not as metaphysics, but as empirical machinery. Carnap brings it back. A theory of sense. But this time, redeemed, stripped of metaphysical heaviness, wrapped in syntax, indexed by data, and governed by the principle of tolerance. But before Carnap rebuilds the house, we need to meet the one who tried to burn the blueprint. Let's talk about Wittgenstein. Somewhere near the back wall, Wittgenstein stands alone. Russell's student, but already slipping away from him. He took Russell's economy, that impulse to say only what's needed, and turned it into quietism. Not a theory, but a posture. If two people agree on what Pegasus means, then that's all there is. Nothing behind it. No metaphysical residue. The meaning is the use. Full stop. But on the other side of the room, Carnap arrives with a different energy. He read Frege and saw something else. Where Frege saw structure, Carnap saw systems. He wasn't content with silence. He wanted models. For Carnap, intention wasn't a ghost to be exercised, but a pattern to be theorized. He says, why stay Wittgensteinian and quiet about what happens between minds? If two people agree that Pegasus doesn't exist, fine. But how did they get there? One came through literature, the other through astronomy. That's not trivial. It's the path of comprehension, and it matters. Carnap wants to map those paths, so he builds semantic frames, possible languages, abstract linguists named Carl, who learn truth conditions the way children learn chess. Not just what the pieces do, but why the rules matter. And now, the theory of meaning becomes empirical, at least to the extent that we can interrogate machines and simulate understanding. No more haunted third realms, no more letters that kill. Carnap looks at Russell's paradox and says, that only happens if you treat your language like a monolith. We don't need that anymore. Instead, he invokes his principle of tolerance. We are free to choose any linguistic framework we like. The fear of semantic hyperinflation. That's a choice. You're not doomed to it. Just design your language properly. Define your rules. And don't overreach. Meaning becomes a map, a navigational grid where intention is modeled, tracked, and cross-referenced. 4. Now, he wins the endgame? Do we know who won? It's tempting to say no, that the jury's still out, that some still side with Russell's austerity, others with Carnap's architecture, and a few with Wittgenstein's shrug. Philosophy, after all, isn't known for consensus. But I'll take a different path.
Because even without agreement, there's a shape that emerges, a pressure that no system, no framework, no theory of meaning can ignore. Experience pushes back, and only some models bend without breaking. That's where Quine enters. Not with a new formalism, not with modal scaffolds or semantic coordinates, but with a test. Does your theory survive revision? Does it adapt when observation contradicts it? When someone asks, why trust the climatologist over the prophet of Elvis and the polar bear? Can you answer without building a mythology? Quine says, forget possible worlds. Forget intention as architectural blueprint. Forget meanings floating in semantic heaven. What matters is how your beliefs behave when the world hits back. What matters is revisability, not what you postulate, but what you're willing to abandon.
Hi, I'm Lucas, and this is going to be a comment on some key passages from Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations. So Wittgenstein starts part 2 of the philosophical investigations with this funny little line. He says, you can imagine an animal angry, frightened, unhappy, happy, startled, but hopeful, and why not? And then, just a few sections later, he shifts. He says, I think this is a bit shocking. Suppose I say of a friend, he isn't an automaton. What does that even tell you? To someone who meets him in ordinary life, what new information could that possibly give? At best, it just means, yeah, this guy behaves like a human being, not sometimes like a machine. And then, in another moment, he changes the scene again. He says, I describe a psychological experiment. The apparatus, the questions, the subject's answers, and then I say, it's a scene in the play, and now everything is different. So I think what's going on here is that Wittgenstein is shifting gears in a way that's not usual for him. He's moving from the classic question, what is meaning? Or what are the mechanical strategies we use to predict or align meaning, into something else, something more dangerous. He is asking, what is human intention? How do we draw the line between someone following a rule like a machine and someone speaking with spontaneity, with authenticity? Now, it's important to say here that commentators don't really agree about what's going on here. Some people say Wittgenstein is showing us that there is not any real difference, that humans and automata cannot be separated by some metaphysical depth. Others think, no, he's preserving a difference, but the difference lives in norms, in practices, in the way we project things, like hope or trust, onto one another. But for me, the interesting part is not even which side is right. It's that Wittgenstein kind of smuggles in the idea that meaning is never cut off from ontology. To say, I understand, is never just about mechanics. It is about the world we have sedimented together, the past we share that let us say, here, this is meaning, and there, it isn't. Even if the surface mechanics look the same. And that's the thing. Wittgenstein wasn't a continental philosopher, but here he almost sounds like one. He is brushing right up against the question, who or what decides where the indeterminacy ends? What stamps the absolute? What says this counts, this is significance? And I think his answer, though he never spells it out, is that it's not hidden in the dog, or in the machine, or in the soul. It's decided in history, in the way society organizes its cultural capital, in the procedures that exclude or admit, that decide who gets recognized as meaningful and who gets dismissed, especially in those high places where ambiguity is intolerable, where something undecidable has to be decided, even if by force. So, when he asks whether a dog can hope, the deeper question is whether we allow it, whether our practices or norms or forms of life are willing to let the dog have hope, or the dog be heard at all, or whether we close it off, call it noise, and move on.